Zarthek had seen many species go to war in his 3 centuries of life, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of humans preparing for battle. The Kytherian observer stood on the command deck of the neutral monitoring vessel, watching through the massive viewports as the human fleet assembled in the void between stars. His 4 eyes tracked the movements of their ships with growing unease. The humans had arrived 12 hours ago, responding to the distress call from the mining colony on Zirian Prime. The Harva Collective had laid siege to the planet for 6 standard days, their biomechanical swarms consuming everything in their path. 23 other species had already evacuated their personnel, writing off the colony as lost. The mathematical certainty was clear. The Harvik had brought enough forces to strip a planet bare in under a week. But humans, as Zarthek was learning, did not calculate war the same way as other species. Captain Sarah Chun stood in the center of the human flagship's bridge, her uniform crisp despite the long journey through hyperspace. Around her, dozens of crew members worked with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical, yet there was something else in their movements, something that made Zarthek's chitinous skin crawl with recognition. He had seen that same look in the eyes of wounded predators on his homeworld, the kind that became most dangerous when cornered. "Admiral, we're receiving the colony's final transmission," reported the communications officer, her voice steady despite the content of the message crackling through the speakers. The voice was human, strained with exhaustion and fear. "This is Colonial Administrator Williams on Zirian Prime. We've lost the northern sectors. The Harvik are breaking through our final defensive line. We estimate 4 hours before total planetary consumption begins. If anyone receives this message, tell our families we held as long as we could." The bridge fell silent. Zarthek watched the human faces carefully, cataloging their reactions. Other species would show resignation at this point, perhaps anger at arriving too late. But the human showed something else entirely, something that made his translator struggle to find appropriate words. Determination. Not the rational determination of a calculated military strategy, but something primal and absolute. Admiral Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face carved from stone. "How many civilians remain on the surface?" "Approximately 47,000 in the primary shelter complex," came the reply. "Mixed species, but mostly human families from the agricultural sectors." Zarthek felt his breathing quicken. 47,000 lives against a Harvik swarm that had already consumed 3 planets. The mathematics were impossible. Even if the human fleet could somehow break through the orbital blockade, the biological mass of the Harvik ground forces would overwhelm any rescue attempt. "Time to optimal rescue window," Morrison asked. "Sir, there's no optimal rescue window," the tactical officer replied. "The Harvik have established a complete sphere around the planet. 12 biomech capital ships, hundreds of smaller vessels, and an estimated 6 million ground units. Our force consists of 27 ships and 40,000 Marines." The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Zarthek had observed enough warfare to understand the brutal calculus. The humans were outnumbered 6-1 in space, and the ground forces were so overwhelmingly outmatched that no sane military commander would even attempt landing. But Admiral Morrison nodded, as if the officer had just confirmed the weather forecast. "Begin Operation Shepherd's Crook," he ordered. Zarthek quickly accessed his personal database, searching for any reference to this operation. Nothing appeared in any known military doctrine. Around him, other neutral observers from various species watched with similar confusion as the human fleet began to move. But their movement was all wrong. Instead of forming the defensive formations that galactic military doctrine prescribed for such overwhelming odds, the human ships began to spread out in what appeared to be a completely vulnerable position. Worse, they were accelerating directly toward the Harvik blockade without any apparent strategy. "Observer Zarthek," came a voice beside him. He turned to see Ambassador Kelthera, the Vorthan representative whose people have lost 12 colonies to Harvik invasions. "Perhaps you could explain human military tactics to those of us unfamiliar with their methods?" Zarthek's mandibles clicked nervously. I confess, Ambassador, their strategy appears unconventional. That was a diplomatic understatement. What the humans were doing looked like an elaborate form of suicide. The Harvick response was immediate and predictable. The biomechanical ships began to converge on the approaching human fleet like antibodies responding to an infection. Their living vessels pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that Zarthek recognized as excitement. The Harvick were anticipating an easy victory. On the human flagship, Captain Shin studied the tactical display with calm focus. Signal all ships. Initiate Theta Protocol on my mark. Zarthek had never heard of Theta Protocol, but the way every human on the bridge straightened suggested it was significant. Ma'am, the weapons officer called out. The Harvick are taking the bait. 70% of their fleet is moving to intercept our main force. Good. That should give Phoenix Squadron their opening. Phoenix Squadron? Zarthek frantically searched his sensors for any indication of additional human forces. The only ships visible were the 27 vessels currently flying into what appeared to be certain death. Then, space itself seemed to tear open. Where moments before there had been empty void, massive human vessels emerged from what Zarthek's instruments frantically identified as dimensional fold drives. Not the standard hyperspace entry that all species use, but something that bypassed known physics entirely. The new ships were unlike anything in the human fleet registry. Where typical human vessels were angular and utilitarian, these ships flowed like living metal, their hulls covered in patterns that seemed to shift and change as Zarthek watched. By the deep currents, whispered Ambassador Kelthra. Were those vessels? One of the human technicians glanced their way. Phoenix-class deep strike carriers. Experimental ships built for impossible missions. The lead Phoenix vessel began to transmit on an open channel, and the voice that emerged made Zarthek's blood freeze in his veins. This is Colonel Martinez, Phoenix leader. We have visual confirmation on civilian shelter complex. Beginning immediate extraction operation. On the tactical display, Zarthek watched in mounting horror and fascination as the Phoenix ships did something that violated every principle of space warfare he had ever learned. Instead of engaging the Harvick fleet, they dove directly toward the planet's surface, their hulls beginning to glow as they entered the atmosphere at speeds that should have torn them apart. But that was impossible. No ship could survive atmospheric entry at combat velocity, especially while under fire from planetary defense systems. Yet somehow, the Phoenix vessels were not only surviving, but accelerating. Admiral Morrison's voice cut through the comm chatter. All ships, commence Operation Shepherd's Crook, Phase 2. Show them what happens when you threaten human children. What followed challenged everything Zarthek thought he knew about warfare, physics, and the nature of courage itself. The human fleet suddenly split apart in a maneuver so complex that his tactical computers couldn't track all the individual ship movements. Instead of the expected frontal assault, the humans began what could only be described as a three-dimensional dance through the Harvick formation. Ships that moments before had seemed to be flying in random patterns suddenly revealed themselves to be part of an intricate web of crossfire. Human vessels appeared where none had been, disappeared when they should have been destroyed, and fired weapons that his sensors couldn't classify. But it was the ground assault that truly defied comprehension. The Phoenix ships didn't land on Zirian Prime. They arrived like controlled meteors, their hulls shedding sections that revealed themselves to be individual drop pods. Thousands of them, screaming through the atmosphere in patterns too complex for the Harvick defensive systems to track effectively. Within minutes, human soldiers were fighting on the surface against odds that should have guaranteed their immediate destruction. Yet somehow, they were not only surviving, but advancing toward the civilian shelters through terrain swarming with Harvick biowarriors. Zarthek watched the ground battle unfold through long-range sensors, and what he saw challenged his understanding of biological limits. Human soldiers moved with coordination that suggested shared consciousness, yet maintained individual tactical flexibility. They used weapons that adapted to Harvick countermeasures in real time, and employed strategies that seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they occurred. How are they doing this? Ambassador Kelthera's voice was barely a whisper. Captain Shun, overhearing the question, turned toward the observation deck. Her expression was grim, but determined. Because they're human children down there. And humans don't abandon their children. The simple statement carried weight that Zarthek found disturbing. He had studied human culture extensively, but this went beyond cultural analysis. This was something fundamental about the species that couldn't be quantified or predicted. On the surface of Zirian Prime, the impossible was happening. Human forces that should have been overwhelmed in minutes were not only holding their ground, but systematically dismantling Harvick positions that had been considered impregnable. The biomechanical swarms that had consumed 3 planets were being pushed back by an enemy. They outnumbered 30-1. The Harvick, for the first time in Zarthek's observation, seemed confused. Their standard, overwhelming tactics weren't working. Their adaptive bioweapons were being countered faster than they could evolve. And, most disturbing of all, the humans seemed to be getting stronger as the battle progressed. "Sir," the human communications officer called out, "we're receiving reports from Phoenix ground teams. Civilian extraction is proceeding ahead of schedule. First transport ships will be ready for departure in 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The humans were planning to evacuate 47,000 civilians from a planet under siege by a force that had never suffered defeat. In 30 minutes. Zarthek's 4 eyes tracked back to the space battle, where the human fleet continued its impossible dance through the Harvick formation. Ships that should have been destroyed hours ago continued fighting with effectiveness that increased rather than decreased over time. Then he noticed something that made his breathing stop entirely. The humans were singing. Not all of them, and not loudly, but his sensitive hearing picked up the sound filtering through the comm channels. A low, rhythmic chant that seemed to synchronize with their combat movements. It wasn't words in any language his translator recognized. It was something older, more fundamental. It was the sound of a species that had evolved as persistence hunters, creatures that had conquered their homeworld not through overwhelming strength, but through the simple, terrifying refusal to give up. And as Zarthek listened to that ancient song echoing through the void of space, he began to understand why the galaxy feared humanity. It wasn't their technology, though that was impressive. It wasn't their individual strength, though they were formidable. It was their absolute, unshakable conviction that some things were worth dying for, combined with their terrifying tendency to find ways to accomplish the impossible rather than accept defeat. On Zirian Prime, the first civilian transport ships began lifting off from the shelter complex, their hulls scarred but intact. Human soldiers maintained defensive perimeters that shouldn't have been possible to hold, buying time for evacuation through sheer determination and tactical innovation. In orbit, the human fleet continued its deadly waltz through the Harvick formation, each ship movement part of a larger pattern that was slowly, methodically destroying an enemy force 6 times their size. And in the depths of space, more human vessels were emerging from dimensional folds, bringing reinforcements that weren't reinforcements at all, but families coming to collect their own. Because that, Zarthek was beginning to realize, was what made humans truly terrifying. They didn't fight like soldiers following orders or predators seeking prey. They fought like parents protecting their children. And nothing in the galaxy was more dangerous than that. The evacuation of Zirian Prime continued with methodical precision that defied every military manual Zarthek had studied. 3 hours into the operation, 17,000 civilians had already been extracted from the shelter complex, loaded into transport vessels that moved through the battlefield like ghosts sliding between reality and nightmare. But it was what happened next that truly shattered Zarthek's understanding of human warfare. "Admiral Morrison," came a transmission from Phoenix leader on the surface. "We have a problem." The human commander's voice remained steady, but Zarthek's sensitive hearing detected subtle stress markers that suggested the situation had deteriorated significantly. "Go ahead, Colonel Martinez." "Sir, we've discovered additional survivors in the outer settlements." Approximately 12,000 individuals, mostly children and elderly, trapped in the mining complexes 30 kilometers from our current position. The Harvik have them completely surrounded. Zarthek felt his chitinous plates shift with anxiety. 30 kilometers through hostile territory occupied by millions of biomechanical warriors. Even if the humans could somehow fight their way through, the time required would allow the Harvik to overwhelm their current position and massacre the civilians they were already protecting. The mathematics were impossible. Protecting one group meant abandoning the other. Admiral Morrison studied the tactical display for exactly 3 seconds. "Colonel, how many of your people would you need to break through to the mining complexes?" "Sir, with respect, breaking through isn't the problem. The problem is that we can't abandon our current defensive positions without exposing the main shelter complex. We need every soldier here to maintain the perimeter." Silence stretched across the bridge. Zarthek watched the human faces carefully, looking for signs of the resignation that would come when any rational species accepted an impossible choice. Instead, Captain Shin stepped forward. "Admiral, requesting permission to implement Protocol 7. Every human on the bridge turned to stare at her. Whatever Protocol 7 was, it clearly wasn't standard procedure. "Sarah," Admiral Morrison's voice carried warning. "Protocol 7 hasn't been tested under combat conditions. The psychological strain alone could be fatal." "Sir, there are children in those mining complexes." "Human children." The way she said those words made Zarthek's translator circuits struggle. The emotional weight behind them seemed to carry meanings his technology couldn't process. Admiral Morrison closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Zarthek saw something that chilled him to his core. Not fear or resignation, but a kind of cold determination that suggested the humans were about to do something that would redefine the nature of warfare itself. "Protocol 7 is approved. May the Void have mercy on us all." Captain Shin nodded and moved to a console that Zarthek hadn't noticed before. It was isolated from the main systems, covered by what appeared to be both electronic and physical locks. She began entering a code sequence so complex that his enhanced vision couldn't track all the movements. "Observer Zarthek," Ambassador Kelthero whispered beside him. "What is Protocol 7? Before he could respond that he didn't know, the human communications officer answered in a voice that carried barely suppressed terror. "Ma'am, it's the Berserker Protocol. Neural enhancement technology that allows human soldiers to access combat capabilities beyond normal biological limits." Zarthek's 4 eyes widened. Every species in the galaxy had experimented with combat enhancement technology. Most had abandoned it after discovering that the psychological cost was too severe. Enhanced soldiers inevitably suffered complete mental breakdown within hours. The humans perfected it. Ambassador Kelthra asked. "No," Captain Shin replied, her fingers still dancing over the complex controls. "We just learned to accept the cost." On the surface of Zirian Prime, something extraordinary began to happen. The human soldiers defending the shelter complex started moving differently. Their coordination, already impressive, became something beyond military precision. Individual squads began operating with tactical efficiency that suggested shared consciousness, yet maintained the creative problem-solving ability that had always marked human warfare. But it was their speed that truly shocked Zarthek. Human soldiers, weighed down by combat armor and equipment, suddenly began moving across the battlefield like liquid death. They flowed around Harvick positions, through terrain that should have been impassable, with grace that defied their species' normal physical limitations. On the tactical display, Zarthek watched red icons representing human forces begin to divide. Half maintained the defensive perimeter around the shelter complex, while the other half started moving toward the mining settlements at speeds that his instruments insisted were impossible for infantry. "How fast are they moving?" he asked aloud. The human tactical officer checked his instruments twice before responding. "Sustained movement at 63 kilometers per hour across broken terrain, sir. Combat effective throughout. 63 kilometers per hour." on foot, through territory swarming with hostile biomechanical warriors. But speed was only part of the change. The enhanced human soldiers began demonstrating combat capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological warfare. They anticipated Harvick movements with uncanny accuracy, used weapons with precision that suggested computer-assisted targeting, and coordinated attacks across impossible distances without any visible communication. "Sir," Phoenix Leader's voice crackled through the comm system. "Strike Team Alpha has reached the outer perimeter of the mining complex. Beginning infiltration. Estimated time to civilian extraction, 47 minutes. 47 minutes to penetrate a position that had been considered impregnable. Locate 12,000 civilians scattered across multiple mining shafts, and extract them through 30 kilometers of hostile territory." On any other day, with any other species, Zarthek would have considered such a claim delusional. Today, watching enhanced humans move through the Harvick forces like ghosts made of violence and determination, he found himself believing it might actually be possible. The space battle above Zirian Prime had evolved into something that defied conventional tactical analysis. The human fleet, still outnumbered 6-1, had somehow managed to divide the Harvick formation into isolated groups that could be overwhelmed locally despite the overall numerical disadvantage. But it was the arrival of additional human vessels that truly demonstrated the species' commitment to protecting their own. New contacts emerging from hyperspace, the sensor officer reported. 17 ships, configuration unknown. Zarthek focused his attention on the newcomers and felt his breathing quicken. These weren't military vessels at all. They were converted civilian ships, freighters, and passenger liners that had been hastily equipped with weapons and armor. "Admiral," came a transmission from the lead civilian vessel. "This is Captain Jennifer Walsh, commanding the civilian evacuation fleet. We've got food, medical supplies, and temporary housing for 50,000 refugees. Where do you need us?" The implication struck Zarthek like a physical blow. These weren't military reinforcements responding to orders. They were civilian volunteers who had organized themselves to rescue people they had never met, simply because those people were human. Admiral Morrison's response was immediate. "Captain Walsh, maintain position at Jump Point Alpha. We'll have the first refugee transports to you within 30 minutes. "Understood, Admiral. Tell Phoenix Team that most of us have kids in those mining complexes. We're not leaving without them." The conversation continued, but Zarthek found himself studying the tactical display with growing comprehension. The human strategy wasn't based on military doctrine at all. It was based on something far more fundamental and far more dangerous. They were treating this as a family emergency on a galactic scale. On the surface, Strike Team Alpha had penetrated the mining complex and begun the delicate process of locating and extracting civilians from shafts that extended hundreds of meters underground. The enhanced soldiers moved through the labyrinthine tunnels with efficiency that suggested they had blueprints memorized, though Zarthek knew the facility schematics weren't in any database. They were simply learning the layout as they moved, processing spatial information at accelerated rates, and sharing that data instantaneously with their teammates. "Contact," came Phoenix Leader's voice. "Large concentration of civilians in Shaft 7, Level 12. Approximately 3,000 individuals, mostly families. They're scared but alive." "Copy that. Medical teams are en route. What's the tactical situation?" "Heavy Harvick presence between Shaft 7 and the extraction point. Biomechanical swarms have established defensive positions in the main corridors. We'll need to clear them before we can move the civilians." Zarthek watched the tactical display as human forces began what could only be described as control violence on a scale that defied comprehension. The enhanced soldiers moved through Harvick defensive positions like a force of nature, dismantling biomechanical constructs that had been designed to be indestructible. But it wasn't just their enhanced physical capabilities that made them effective. It was their absolute refusal to accept failure. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, They improvised new ones from mining equipment. When direct routes were blocked, they created new passages through solid rock. When Harvick forces adapted to their tactics, they evolved faster. Shaft 7 is clear, Phoenix leader reported. Beginning civilian evacuation. Estimated time to surface, 23 minutes. 23 minutes to move 3,000 people through 12 levels of underground mining complex, while under fire from biomechanical warriors. The logistics alone should have required hours of careful planning. But Zarthek was beginning to understand that humans didn't approach problems the same way as other species. Where other civilizations would develop careful, methodical solutions, humans seemed to specialize in impossible improvisation driven by absolute determination. On the space battlefront, the civilian evacuation fleet had begun receiving the first refugee transports from a shelter complex. Zarthek watched families being reunited across the void of space, civilian volunteers working alongside military personnel, with coordination that suggested they had trained together for years. Observer Zarthek, Ambassador Kelthera said quietly, I'm beginning to understand why the Harvick have never encountered resistance like this. Zarthek nodded slowly. Other species fight to achieve victory. Humans fight to protect what they love. The distinction, he was realizing, made all the difference. Military victory could be calculated, predicted, and ultimately defeated through superior force or tactics. But love was something else entirely. Love didn't calculate odds. Love didn't accept impossible situations. Love didn't surrender when faced with overwhelming opposition. Love found ways to do the impossible because the alternative was unacceptable. On Zirian Prime, the mining complex evacuation continued with methodical precision. Enhanced human soldiers carried children through corridors filled with hostile biomechanical constructs. Medical teams treated injured civilians in underground chambers while artillery exploded overhead, and transport pilots flew impossible routes through atmospheric combat zones to ferry families to safety. And somehow impossibly it was working. All civilians extracted from mining complex, Phoenix leader reported. Beginning withdrawal to primary extraction point. Casualties minimal. Minimal casualties. From an operation that should have resulted in total catastrophe. Zarthek studied the tactical display one more time and, finally, understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a military operation or even a rescue mission. This was humanity demonstrating to the galaxy exactly why they should be feared. Not because they were the strongest or the most technologically advanced, but because they were the species that would burn down the universe itself before they would abandon their own. The evacuation reached its critical phase as the enhanced human soldiers began their fighting withdrawal from the mining complex. Zarthek watched through high-resolution sensors as Strike Team Alpha moved through terrain that had become a hellscape of biomechanical warfare, carrying wounded civilians and protecting family groups with dedication that bordered on the supernatural. But it was what happened next that revealed the true depth of human tactical thinking. Admiral, came a transmission from an unexpected source. This is Dr. Elizabeth Santos aboard the research vessel Prometheus. We've completed our analysis of the Harvick biomechanical systems. Zarthek's 4 eyes focused on the tactical display. He hadn't even noticed the research vessel arrive. It was a small, unremarkable ship that had somehow positioned itself within sensor range of the battlefield without attracting attention. Go ahead, Dr. Santos, Admiral Morrison replied. Sir, we've identified a critical weakness in the Harvick collective consciousness matrix. Their biomechanical warriors are controlled by a central node located in their primary command vessel. If we can disrupt that signal, their entire ground force will become effectively paralyzed for approximately 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Zarthek calculated rapidly. More than enough time to complete the evacuation and extract all human forces from the surface. But the primary command vessel was a massive biomechanical construct surrounded by the densest concentration of defensive ships in the enemy formation. Attacking it directly would require sacrificing most of the human fleet. Dr. Santos, Admiral Morrison's voice carried careful consideration. What would be required to implement your findings? A quantum resonance pulse delivered directly to the command vessel's neural core. We need to get within 500 meters and maintain position for approximately 30 seconds to ensure complete neural disruption. 500 meters. From a ship designed to resist all known weapons and defended by enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. Zarthek expected the Admiral to reject the proposal as tactically impossible. Instead, Morrison turned to Captain Shun with an expression that suggested he was about to order something unprecedented. "Sarah, how confident are you in the Phantom Protocol?" Captain Chen's face went pale. "Sir, the Phantom Protocol has never been tested against biomechanical sensors. If it fails, we lose our flagship and everyone aboard. And if we don't try, we lose everyone on the surface. Execute Phantom Protocol. Target the command vessel." Zarthek quickly accessed his databases, searching for any reference to this new protocol. Again, nothing appeared in any known military doctrine. The humans seemed to have developed an entire arsenal of impossible technologies that they deployed only when conventional warfare failed. Around him, the bridge crew began implementing procedures that defied his understanding of physics. Sections of the ship's hull began to shift and flow like liquid metal, reconfiguring themselves into patterns that seemed to bend light around them. "Activating quantum displacement field," the chief engineer reported. "Hull integrity holding at optimal parameters. Stealth effectiveness. Sir, we're essentially invisible to all known sensor types." Invisible. The human flagship had somehow rendered itself undetectable to both conventional sensors and biomechanical perception systems. But becoming invisible was only the first step in what Zarthek was beginning to realize was the most audacious military operation he had ever witnessed. The human flagship began moving through the Harvick formation with impossible stealth, threading between enemy vessels that showed no awareness of its presence. On the tactical display, Zarthek watched the ship's icon slide past defensive positions that should have detected and destroyed it instantly. Meanwhile, on the surface of Zirian Prime, the final phase of the evacuation proceeded with mechanical precision. The last civilian transports lifted off from the mining complex as enhanced human soldiers provided covering fire against Harvick forces that seemed increasingly disorganized and confused. "Phoenix Leader to all units," came the transmission. "We are Oscar Mike to Extraction Point Alpha. All civilians accounted for. Casualties remain minimal. Minimal casualties." After 6 hours of combat against overwhelming odds, the humans had successfully evacuated 47,000 civilians from a planet under siege by forces that had never before been defeated. But Zarthek was beginning to understand that the evacuation had never been the real objective. The real objective was what was happening in orbit, where a single human vessel was approaching the most heavily defended target in the galaxy with technology that shouldn't exist and determination that defied rational explanation. "Approaching target vessel," Captain Chen reported. "Distance, 2,000 meters, and closing. Stealth systems holding." On the main viewer, the Harvick command vessel filled the screen, a massive, organic construct that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns and bristled with weapons that could reduce a planet to ash. The sight of it made Zarthek's chitinous plates instinctively contract with fear. But the humans showed no fear at all. They approached the biomechanical Leviathan with the same calm professionalism they had displayed throughout the entire operation. 1,000 meters, Chen continued. "Harvick vessel shows no awareness of our presence. Beginning final approach." Dr. Santos, Admiral Morrison called. "Are your systems ready? Quantum resonance generator is charged and locked on a target. We'll need to maintain position for 30 seconds once we're in range. 30 seconds at point-blank range from the most dangerous ship in the galaxy. 30 seconds during which the slightest malfunction in their stealth technology would result in instant annihilation." Zarthek found himself holding his breath as the human flagship slipped closer to its target. 500 meters, Chun announced. Beginning resonance pulse sequence. What happened next challenged everything Zarthek thought he knew about biomechanical technology. The quantum resonance generator, whatever impossible science it represented, began emitting a frequency that made the very fabric of space seem to vibrate. The Harvick command vessel's response was immediate and catastrophic. The massive biomechanical construct began convulsing as if in agony, its bioluminescent patterns shifting from organized communication networks to chaotic, random flashes. The organic hull rippled and twisted as neural connections that had controlled millions of warriors across 3-star systems began to fail. Resonance pulse holding steady, Dr. Santos reported. Neural disruption cascade is propagating through their entire network. Estimated time to complete neural collapse, 27 seconds. 27 seconds. Zarthek watched the tactical display as Harvick forces throughout the system began to exhibit signs of the neural disruption. Biomechanical ships that moments before had moved with coordinated precision now drifted aimlessly through space. On the surface of Zirian Prime, the effect was even more dramatic. Millions of ground-based biomechanical warriors simply stopped fighting. Some collapsed entirely, while others began moving in random, purposeless patterns. All Phoenix units, came Admiral Morrison's voice over the comm system. This is your extraction window. Move now. The enhanced human soldiers didn't need to be told twice. With their enemies effectively paralyzed, they began a coordinated withdrawal that demonstrated military efficiency at its absolute peak. Transport ships that had been waiting at the edge of the atmosphere dove toward the surface to collect the last of the evacuation teams. But even in a moment of victory, the humans demonstrated the characteristic that Zarthek was beginning to understand defined their entire species. They didn't celebrate. They didn't congratulate themselves on achieving the impossible. They simply focused on the next task with the same grim determination that had carried them through 6 hours of impossible warfare. Extraction teams Alpha through Delta are aboard, Phoenix leader reported. All human forces have successfully withdrawn from the surface. 0 casualties in final extraction. 0 casualties. After everything they had endured, after operations that should have resulted in massive losses, the humans had somehow brought everyone home. But the neural disruption was temporary. As Dr. Santos had warned, the Harvick would recover their coordination within minutes. When that happened, the humans would once again face impossible odds, unless they did something about it first. Admiral, Captain Shin said quietly, we have approximately 7 minutes before the Harvick neural network reestablishes itself. Requesting permission to implement Terminal Protocol. Terminal Protocol. The name alone sent chills through Zarthek's exoskeleton. Admiral Morrison studied the tactical display for a long moment. Sarah, Terminal Protocol will require us to sacrifice the Prometheus and Dr. Santos's entire research team. Sir, came Dr. Santos's voice over the comm. We volunteer for Terminal Protocol. Our research was always intended for this purpose. The casual way she discussed sacrificing her life made Zarthek realize that he still didn't fully understand human psychology. Dr. Santos and her team had apparently spent years developing technology specifically designed to be used in a suicide mission. And they seemed perfectly at peace with that fact. Terminal Protocol is approved, Admiral Morrison said quietly. Dr. Santos, it has been an honor. The honor was ours, Admiral. Beginning Terminal Protocol sequence. On the tactical display, Zarthek watched the research vessel Prometheus detach from its position and begin moving toward the paralyzed Harvick fleet. As it moved, the ship began to glow with energy patterns that his instruments couldn't identify. Terminal Protocol involves converting the ship's quantum resonance generator into a singularity bomb, Captain Shun explained, apparently noticing his confusion. When it detonates inside the Harvick formation, it will create a localized gravitational anomaly that should destroy their entire fleet. A singularity bomb. The humans had developed technology capable of creating artificial black holes. and they were willing to sacrifice an entire research team to deploy it. Prometheus approaching optimal detonation position, Dr. Santos reported. Her voice remained perfectly calm despite the fact that she was flying toward certain death. Biomechanical fleet remains paralyzed. Detonation sequence initiated. Zarthek watched in fascination and horror as the human research vessel positioned itself in the center of the Harvick formation. The biomechanical ships drifted around it like sleeping giants, unaware that they were about to be annihilated. Detonation in 10 seconds, Dr. Santos announced. Tell our families we chose to make this count. The explosion, when it came, was unlike anything Zarthek had ever witnessed. Instead of the brilliant flash typically associated with military weapons, the singularity bomb created a sphere of absolute darkness that seemed to devour light itself. The Harvick fleet simply ceased to exist. Massive biomechanical constructs that had terrorized 3-star systems were compressed into nothingness in the space of seconds, drawn into a gravitational anomaly that consumed everything within a 100-kilometer radius. When the darkness finally dissipated, only empty space remained where the most powerful fleet in the galaxy had been moments before. Complete and total victory, achieved through sacrifice, determination, and technologies that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. But as Zarthek studied the human faces around him, he saw no triumph or celebration. Instead, he saw a quiet satisfaction mixed with grief for the colleagues who had given their lives to make victory possible. All ships, Admiral Morrison announced, begin recovery operations. Let's bring our people home. In the aftermath of the Zirian Prime operation, Zarthek found himself aboard the human flagship, invited to witness what Admiral Morrison called the debriefing process. What he observed there completed his education in human warfare and left him with an understanding that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The conference room was filled with officers from every ship in the fleet, along with representatives from the civilian evacuation vessels and even some of the enhanced soldiers who had led the ground operations. The atmosphere was businesslike, professional, and completely lacking in the celebration that should have followed such a decisive victory. Colonel Martinez, Admiral Morrison began, addressing the Phoenix leader who had coordinated the surface operations. Casualties report. 3 wounded, none critical. All enhanced personnel are showing expected recovery patterns from the Berserker Protocol. Psychological evaluations will be completed within 72 hours. 3 wounded. From an operation that should have resulted in catastrophic losses. Dr. Santos's team, the Admiral asked quietly. 17 researchers and support staff aboard the Prometheus, Captain Shin reported. They knew the risks and volunteered for terminal protocol. Their sacrifice saved 47,000 civilian lives and prevented the Harvick from regrouping for another assault. The way they discussed the loss of human life struck Zarthek as both callous and profoundly caring. They mourned their dead without sentimentality, but the weight of those losses was clearly felt by everyone in the room. Tactical analysis, Morrison continued. What did we learn? What followed was the most chilling military briefing Zarthek had ever heard. The humans didn't discuss their victory as an end in itself, but as a data collection exercise. Every aspect of the operation was analyzed for weaknesses, inefficiencies, and areas for improvement. They discussed their impossible technologies and impossible tactics with the same matter-of-fact professionalism that other species reserved for routine maintenance procedures. The Phantom Protocol performed within acceptable parameters, Captain Shin reported, but the stealth field showed a 3% degradation when approaching biomechanical sensors. We'll need to adjust the quantum displacement matrix for future operations. Enhanced soldier performance exceeded projections, Colonel Martinez added. Recovery time from Berserker Protocol was 47% faster than laboratory tests suggested. We could sustain enhanced operations for longer periods than originally calculated. The Singularity Bomb worked exactly as designed, came a voice from the research division. However, we lost valuable research data when the Prometheus was destroyed. Future terminal protocol missions should include data transmission capabilities to preserve tactical intelligence. They were already planning future operations. Before the smoke had cleared from their current victory, the humans were analyzing how to fight the next impossible war. But it was the discussion of civilian casualties that truly revealed the nature of human warfare. 0 civilian losses, reported the evacuation coordinator. All 47,000 individuals were successfully extracted and are currently receiving medical care aboard the civilian fleet. Family reunification is proceeding ahead of schedule. 0 civilian losses. In the middle of the most intense combat operation Zarthek had ever witnessed, the humans had somehow managed to protect every single non-combatant. That brings us to the strategic implications, Admiral Morrison said, his voice carrying weight that made the entire room fall silent. The Harvick Collective has never suffered a complete defeat. They've lost individual battles, but never an entire fleet. This changes everything. Zarthek leaned forward, understanding that he was about to hear something significant. The Harvick will respond to this loss, Morrison continued. They'll analyze our tactics, adapt their technologies, and return with forces specifically designed to counter everything we use today. We have perhaps 6 months before they launch a retaliatory strike. 6 months. The humans had just achieved the impossible, and they were already preparing for an even more difficult war. With respect, Admiral, Colonel Martinez said, "Let them come." Today proved that human forces can defeat any enemy when our families are threatened. The Harvick may adapt, but so will we. The simple statement carried absolute confidence. Not arrogance or bravado, but the calm certainty of a species that had just demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice anything to protect their own. That brings us to the real purpose of this debriefing, Admiral Morrison announced. Observer Zarthek, would you please share your analysis with the assembled officers? Zarthek felt his chitinous plates shift with surprise. He hadn't expected to be asked for his observations, but as he looked around the room at the human faces watching him expectantly, he realized they genuinely wanted to understand how their tactics appeared to outside observers. He stood slowly, gathering his thoughts. How could he explain to them what he had witnessed? How could he make them understand the implications of their own capabilities? Admiral, officers of the human fleet, he began, I have observed many species at war during my 3 centuries of life. I have studied military tactics, analyzed combat effectiveness, and evaluated the strategic capabilities of dozens of civilizations. He paused, looking around the room at faces that showed polite attention, but no particular concern. What I witnessed today was not warfare as understood by galactic civilization. It was something else entirely. Something that challenges the fundamental assumptions we make about military conflict. Interest sharpened in the human expressions. They were listening intently now. Other species fight to achieve specific objectives. Territory, resources, strategic advantage. Victory is measured by the successful completion of defined goals within acceptable casualty parameters. Zarthek gestured toward the tactical displays that still showed the empty space where the Harvick fleet had been destroyed. But humans don't fight for objectives. You fight for people. And that changes everything about the nature of warfare itself. He could see puzzlement on some faces, but understanding beginning to dawn on others. When the Harvick besieged this planet, 23 species calculated the odds and withdrew. The mathematics were clear. The cost of resistance exceeded any possible benefit. But humans don't calculate warfare the same way. Admiral Morrison nodded slowly. Continue. You developed technologies that shouldn't exist, implemented tactics that violate military doctrine, and accepted casualty rates that would be considered suicidal by any other species. And you did it all to save people you had never met, simply because they were human. Zarthek looked directly at Admiral Morrison. Sir, with your permission, I would like to explain to this assembly exactly why the galaxy fears humanity. Morrison gestured for him to continue. Every other species in the galaxy has limits. Physical limits, technological limits, psychological limits. When we encounter problems that exceed those limits, we adapt our objectives to match our capabilities. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. Humans don't have limits. When you encounter problems that exceed your capabilities, you develop new capabilities. When faced with impossible odds, you redefine what's possible. And when everything else fails, you sacrifice yourself to ensure your people survive. The room was completely silent now. Today, you didn't just defeat the Harvick fleet. You demonstrated that human determination backed by human innovation can overcome any obstacle. You showed the galaxy that there is literally nothing you won't do to protect your own. Zarthek felt his breathing quicken as he reached the heart of his analysis. And that, officers, is why everyone in the galaxy fears humanity. Not because you're the strongest or the most technologically advanced, but because you're the only species that refuses to accept defeat when the lives of your people are at stake. The silence stretched for several seconds before Admiral Morrison spoke. Observer Zarthek, do you believe the galaxy's fear of humanity is justified? Zarthek considered the question carefully. How could he explain that what he had witnessed went beyond military tactics or strategic capability? How could he make them understand that they had demonstrated something that challenged the fundamental nature of civilization itself? Admiral, I believe the galaxy's fear is completely rational. Today, you proved that humans are willing to sacrifice everything, ships, technologies, lives, to save people who matter to you. But more than that, you prove that you have the capability to make those sacrifices effective. He gestured toward the tactical displays showing the successful evacuation statistics. Other species can be deterred by overwhelming force, outmaneuvered by superior tactics, or defeated through attrition. But how do you defeat an enemy that considers the death of their children to be literally unacceptable? How do you negotiate with people who will burn down the universe rather than abandon their own? Colonel Martinez leaned forward. Observer Zarthek, are you suggesting that human tactics are somehow unfair or immoral? Colonel, I'm suggesting that human tactics are beyond moral calculation entirely. When faced with the choice between military pragmatism and protecting your people, you choose to protect your people and then figure out how to make that tactically viable. Zarthek looked around the room at faces that showed growing understanding. That's not unfair or immoral. It's terrifying, because it means that any conflict with humanity becomes a conflict with an enemy that literally cannot be defeated as long as they have people worth protecting. Captain Shun spoke for the first time during the briefing. Observer, what would you recommend to species who find themselves in conflict with humanity? The question struck Zarthek as both genuine and deeply troubling. The humans were asking for advice on how to defeat themselves. Captain, my recommendation to any species considering conflict with humanity would be simple. Don't. He stood up, preparing to deliver his final observation. Today, I watched humans achieve the impossible through a combination of innovation, determination, and sacrifice. But more than that, I watched you do it with the calm professionalism of people who consider the impossible to be routine. Zarthek looked directly at Admiral Morrison. Admiral, the Harvick will adapt to your tactics and return with superior forces. They will study your technologies and develop countermeasures. They will prepare for every strategy you use today. Morrison nodded. And your assessment of the likely outcome? Sir, I believe they will discover what I discovered today, that fighting humans isn't really about tactics or technology at all. It's about fighting people who have made a simple decision that the lives of their families matter more than anything else in the universe. Zarthek felt his chitinous plates settle into their final configuration as he reached his conclusion. And that decision, Admiral, makes humanity the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not because you're naturally violent or inherently aggressive, but because you're naturally protective. And there is nothing more dangerous than parents who will do anything to save their children. The briefing ended in silence that spoke more clearly than words ever could. As Zarthek was escorted back to the observation deck, he carried with him the knowledge that would reshape his understanding of warfare, civilization, and the nature of courage itself. He had seen humans step onto the battlefield, and, finally, understood why they terrify everyone. It wasn't because they were monsters or conquerors. It was because they were exactly what they claimed to be, people who would never, ever give up on each other. And in a galaxy full of species that calculated the odds before choosing their battles, that made humans the most dangerous force anyone could imagine.